I'm Ann Dart.
I'm Tracy Stormy.
And I'm Kathy Knight.
And together we are
It Was a Dark and Stormy Book Club,
a podcast for mystery lovers.
Welcome.
If you enjoy our show, please consider contributing to the Dark and Stormy Patreon. By becoming a patron, you will help us create better and quality content. There are also benefits to becoming a patron, such as exclusive content and Dark and Stormy merchandise. Become a supporter at patreon.com/darkandstormybc. Check our website for the link. We appreciate any and all contributions. Thank you.
Hello and welcome to episode 124. Today we have a visit with Kate Winkler Dawson.
Kate Winkler Dawson joined the University of Texas at Austin's School of Journalism as a senior lecturer in 2009. Before then, she was on the faculty of Fordham University's Marymount College for 2 years. A seasoned documentary producer, news writer, and TV news producer, her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, United Press International in London, WCBS News, ABC News Radio, Fox News Channel, PBS NewsHour, and Nightline. She's on the board of the Texas Center for Actual Innocence and lives in Austin, Texas with her family. American Sherlock, Murder, Forensics, and the Birth of American CSI. Berkeley, California, 1933. In a lab filled with curiosities, beakers, microscopes, Bunsen burners, and hundreds upon hundreds of books, sat an investigator who would go on to crack at least 2,000 cases in his 40-year career. Known as the American Sherlock Holmes, Edward Oscar Heinrich was one of America's greatest and first forensic scientists with an uncanny knack for finding clues, establishing evidence, and deducing answers with a skill that seemed almost supernatural. Based on years of research and thousands of never-before published primary source materials, American Sherlock captures the life of the man who pioneered the science our legal system now relies upon, as well as the limits of those techniques and the very human experts who wield them.
We would like to welcome Kate Winkler Dawson to the program. She is the author of the fascinating book, America's Sherlock Holmes. Welcome, Kate.
Thanks for having me.
Oscar Heinrich was considered America's Sherlock Holmes. He was not always correct in his investigation and used what today's investigators call junk science. Why do you think he was still considered by that name?
He did pioneer some junk science like bloodstain pattern analysis, fingerprinting, but the majority of what he used is very sound science, and that's why he became this incredible forensic scientist who had an international reputation. But when he worked, which really was 1910 until he died in 1953, was the beginning of forensics in America. This is all new for all of these researchers and these forensic scientists. They were sort of flying blind and trying to figure out what the most effective methods were. It's just like at the beginning, the beginning of surgery, you're going to have a lot of mistakes. The beginning of forensics, you're going to have a lot of mistakes too. The question was whether or not Heinrich recognized that these were mistakes or if he believed all of his methods were really accurate, and the answer is he did. He had this sort of unfailing confidence in himself, which was dangerous sometimes in some cases. I think always, particularly when it's life and death, when you have people who are testifying in a capital murder case, if there's the death penalty involved, always people should question themselves, question their skills, question their methods. The jury should question them, and Heinrich just really never did that. He always worked to improve his skills, but he had no doubt in the decisions that he made, and he made some wrong decisions, but the majority of his cases were very sound and right.
Oscar was called in to investigate the case of Virginia Rappe when Fatty Arbuckle was suspected. He was very much disapproving of Arbuckle's lifestyle. Does your research indicate that Oscar tried tried to find evidence that pointed to Fatty's guilt?
I don't think he attempted to find evidence against Fatty Arbuckle. He definitely didn't approve of Hollywood. Oscar was somebody who thought women should still be wearing corsets in the 1920s and 30s. Everybody should be chaperoned. He did not feel comfortable with the Roaring Twenties, for sure. He prided himself on his cases going in the direction that the evidence took him. I do think that his confidence with something as unreliable as fingerprinting, which is unreliable, I think his confidence with fingerprinting really hampered his ability to make an unbiased assessment of that case. So he was relying on unreliable evidence and unreliable techniques. And I certainly do think that Fatty Arbuckle's reputation as being kind of a womanizer was not helpful in this situation. I think he really did hone in on a couple of key pieces of evidence because he was convinced that there was no other way that this could have happened than Fatty Arbuckle assaulted this woman and then unintentionally killed her. There was certainly weaknesses in that case. I mean, poor Fatty Arbuckle has had a reputation going on almost 100 years, being someone who sexually assaulted and killed a minor actress in Hollywood. It just wasn't the case. It was very unfortunate for him and for his career, particularly.
Don't think Oscar was a very romantic figure. Is that part of the reason why he is still unknown? How did you find out about him? What drew you to his story?
What's interesting about Oscar, I think, is, no, he's not a very romantic figure, as in he was kind of stodgy, and as I mentioned before, he was someone who thought women should be wearing corsets. He was pretty conservative in that way. I get a lot of questions, why don't people know who Oscar Heinrich is? I would challenge anyone to name any type of famous forensic scientist, with the exception of maybe someone who appeared at the O.J. Simpson trial. Forensic scientists are not the people who make the headlines. They aren't the prosecutors or the defense attorneys or the investigators who are front and center in the media. They are people who work behind the scenes in a lab with a lab coat, occasionally testify. So these are not people who would be on the covers of magazines or newspapers anyway. I think that he doesn't have a Wikipedia page even because he had impressive cases, but he didn't have a case that has become a fixture in American culture. Like a good example of that would be The Fugitive, which is a Sam Shepard case. You know, Harrison Ford played Sam Shepard, who was accused of killing his wife. It turned out he didn't kill his wife, and a forensic scientist became fairly famous, a man named Paul Kirk, because he solved the case. So Oscar didn't have that kind of a case. That being said, he solved more than 2,000 cases in his lifetime. I was drawn to him because of this moniker, America's Sherlock Holmes, that he had used so many tools in his forensic tool belt, and that he even had this many tools, that he knew botany, and he knew fingerprinting, ballistics, bloodstain pattern analysis. He understood how to use bugs to determine time of death. He had all of these skills that most people didn't have. We don't have generalists now, really. We have experts who know very well ballistics. They're experts in botany, but they're siloed. We don't have these generalists. And Oscar was a generalist. He could walk into a crime scene and find 20 different tests that he could run in all these different disciplines because he knew all of these different disciplines. So it was pretty remarkable what his skills were.
From what I understand, it had to be a researcher's dream that he kept every scrap of paper that he ever wrote. And it sounds to me like he was cross between OCD and a hoarder. Did you think this helped or hurt his career in the long run?
I certainly think that the fact that he hoarded all of his information, I call him a productive hoarder, which means I didn't find things that were meaningless, notes that didn't make sense. He just really kept thorough files that we can get into his personal life a little bit later. He certainly kept detailed information about his personal life, too. Now, I have a friend who asked me, do you think that Oscar became OCD if he hoarded all of this information because he was a forensic scientist and he needed it? He knew he was going to have to recall all of this information, either for trial or in reference to a new case. And I said, no, I think it was the other way around. I think he was OCD, and I think that he became a forensic scientist because of it. He had to be productive. You look at his diaries, he had to juggle 20 or 30 different different cases at the same time. Otherwise, I think it would drive him insane. I'm actually kind of the same way. I probably have a little touch of that also with CPD. I like to juggle a lot of different projects at the same time. And if I don't, I feel kind of out of sorts. So when I saw his archive, I totally understood what he was doing. I understood why he needed to keep this information, the way he needed to do it, how he cataloged it. It was just very clear to me. And I don't know if it would be that clear to other researchers.
Can you explain to our listeners what the Actual Innocence Project is and what your involvement with the organization is?
I grew up with a father who taught at the University of Texas Law School for 37 years. I went to all of his law school classes. I loved it. In another life, I certainly would be an attorney in criminal law. He started in 2005 the Actual Innocence Clinic at the law school. At that clinic, they investigate and still investigate claims of innocence from people who have been imprisoned, people who say they've been wrongfully convicted. And so when my father was dying of lung cancer in 2005, actually he started in 2003, so this was a couple of years after he started the clinic, he asked me to be involved right before he died. He just said, I really want you to reach out and figure out how you can help. And so I did that. After he died, I joined the adjunct faculty at UT. I soon became full-time, but I approached the law school and said I really wanted to co-teach a class where we would take journalism students and pair them up with law school students. I would teach the law school students and the journalism students about interviewing techniques. The journalism students would learn about the law, and I would take them to prison, and we would interview people who claimed that they were innocent. And it was really an incredible collaboration for me, and it was a great way to kind of continue my father's legacy. So in all of the books that I write, there is some element of innocence there. There's some element of the justice system going awry for various different reasons, just what I'm drawn to.
What do you think Oscar would think about all the advancements in forensics today, especially DNA profiling?
I think that Oscar would have loved all of the advancements. I think he would have been most interested. I think DNA would have interested him for sure, because he was always looking for slam dunks. He really wanted hard evidence, forensic evidence, and he believed so passionately about science that the answer to most crimes were going to be found in the lab, not out in the field. I think he would have really been interested in the introduction of MRIs of brain scans into the courtroom, which is problematic, and I think he would have absolutely loved that. You could scan somebody's brain and say, this part of the brain made them do a bad thing. Either they should be punished in the penal system or that they should be released. I mean, I think he would have enjoyed that kind of control. And I think that forensic scientists in the 1920s were really looking for clear answers, very easy answers. This test comes back green, and this means this person is guilty. In some ways, I think that's still the case. I think he could have fallen into the trap that there is an end-all, be-all, that there are absolute answers, when really that's not the truth. You can have DNA evidence, and one piece of DNA evidence can be misleading. You need also circumstantial evidence, and I think that he would have been completely fascinated with more tests and more strategies.
We interviewed a bloodstain pattern analysis expert. At the end of American Sherlock Holmes, you say that this is junk science, but obviously it is still widely used in forensics. Why would this be?
Well, it is considered junk science in many circumstances, not all circumstances, but many circumstances. Bloodstain pattern analysis falls under a category that's called pattern matching. So what that means is it's much like fingerprints or footprints. You are depending on an analyst and how well they are trained to be able to match two patterns together. So if I put a fingerprint down and I'm matching it to another fingerprint, it's really up to the analyst to figure out whether they're equal or not. And somebody in Tennessee may make a different decision than somebody in Texas because they were trained differently. One was trained better than the other. And so it is up to the discretion of the analyst. Bloodstain pattern analysis is very similar to that. It's interpretation. So in 2009, the National Academy of Scientists came out with a scathing report that really dismantled most of forensic tools out there. And bloodstain pattern analysis was really at the top of the list because the inability to predict the height or the direction based on the tails and the heads of bloodstains is really remarkable. It's very high. which means it's difficult to interpret that. And there are things that are easy to interpret with bloodstains generally. So you can tell if there's a void pattern. If you are, for instance, beating someone to death, blood's going everywhere, especially if you have a blunt object, right, that you're using. You, as the killer, will block that blood against the wall. So you could see a void. So using bloodstains, you can say probably the killer was standing there because he blocked the blood from hitting the wall behind him. Being able to predict how tall someone was in a direction based on where the heads or the tails of these blood droplets are is very, very difficult, very unreliable. I'll give you an instance. There's a great reporter named Pam Koloff who works for the New York Times Magazine. So she did a huge investigation on a man from Texas who's in prison